Welcome to this online lesson considering From Slaughter to Success, key events on the Western Front. The aims of this lesson are to categorise British successes and failures in World War I, to explain Britain's successes and failures in World War I, and to assess the extent of British success between 1914 and 1918. So why are we looking at this? Surely this is a source investigation, so how is this relevant? Well, when you're interpreting the sources, frankly, you're meant to be able to put them in historical context. So a source from 1916 might be related to the Battle of the Somme. So you should be referring to that, rather than a source from 1914, which may even be looking at the brief period before trench warfare set in. So understanding the brief chronology of the war, these key events and what happened in them, allows you to contextualise these sources. First of all, though, consider this. Study this map of the Western Front. The British sector is shown in red. The French sectors are shown in blue. There would have been Belgians too, but for simplicity's sake, I've just shown the two. Firstly, which Allied nation took on most of the fighting? And secondly, why do you think the British fought in the northern sectors? Pause the video now while you consider those. Hopefully we've recognised that the French took on most of the fighting against the Germans in World War I, far more than the British. They had more men serve, they suffered far heavier casualties. The eagle-eyed amongst you may have even noticed that the US Army is down there in the south, but really they were only there from 1918 onwards. So why did the British fight in those northern sectors? A lot of it is down to the question of supplies. It's quite near to the Channel coast, places like Calais, and so the British Army was more able to be supplied from Britain. But that's also got relevance to us when we're looking at medical services too. It meant that the wounded who needed to be evacuated out could be got back to Blighty much easier. A war of movement versus static warfare. Although much of World War I was static, unmoving trench warfare, especially on the Western Front, it began and ended with mobile, fast-moving warfare. Although we remember the seemingly hopeless slaughter of the war, actually the British Army had some incredible successes too. So we're going to try and bust a few myths. Our task here is that you're going to create a living graph of the main events of the British Army in World War I. Now, I will qualify this. You can either research this yourself, but if you have your own copy of the Peterson Edexcel textbook, you'll be using pages 112 to 113. I very, very rarely refer to specific page numbers and textbooks within my videos because I appreciate that not all viewers will have that to hand. So, if you do have a textbook, by all means follow the next instructions and have a go at that task. If not, you'll be able to skip on about 30 seconds to a minute or so and be able to carry on in a different direction. Either way, it'll all be covered. So if you are going to be using the textbook, let's move on. First of all, you might want to take a screenshot of this particular diagram rather than having to draw it yourself, or actually because it's quite simple, you could just draw it yourself. So we've got a timeline from 1914 to 1918, British successes at the top and British failures down below. The further up that scale you go, the better the success or the worse the failure. So complete a graph like this one here. Read the events on pages 112 and 113, and for each of the purple boxes which relate to the British sector, decide if it was a success or a failure. The other ones you can put in if you like, but they're not British. Plot each event on the graph, showing how much of a success or a failure it was, and then overall, was the British Army more successful or more of a failure in World War I? We're going to revisit that at the end of the video. You can pause the video now if you're going to complete that because you've got the textbook. If not, just wait a moment and we'll move on to the next task. All right, let's have a look. One thing we might have indicated, for example, is August to September 1914. The British and the French stopped the Germans on the Marne. Another one might be July to November 1916. The British suffered terrible losses in the Battle of the Somme. The top one, as you can see, there is a significant success, and the one underneath is a significant failure. That gives you the idea. Okay, if you don't have a textbook of your own, fear not. I'm going to go through the four main battles now. Research and answer. You'll be shown fairly detailed accounts of four of the most important locations and battles on the British sector in World War I. The exam board has chosen these because they kind of sum up or typify the type of war and tactics that were being fought at that time, or there is something about them that makes them medically significant. That's why we're going to focus on just these four. Your activities then. For each battle or location that we're going to look at, record the following details. Under heading 1, where the fighting happened. Heading 2, what the fighting was like, so the types of weapons and tactics used. Heading 3, what the terrain and land was like. And then the last heading, how successful the British were during this battle and why. At the very least, aim to include one example per heading, but you really should be including between 2 and 3 examples. You could also explain how each battle was unique, in other words, different to the others. Then you're going to be able to check your knowledge. How did the Battle of the Somme put great pressure on medical resources? Thirdly, explain why there was so much fighting in and around the city of Ypres in Belgium. What was so difficult about the fighting conditions at Ypres in 1915, and specifically at Hill 60, which was a location just outside? What new weapons were used at Ypres in 1915 and at Cambrai in 1917? As an extension, explain how effective these weapons were on these occasions. Lastly, what was unusual about what happened at Arras? Okay, you can pause the video now while you note down these tasks, or at the very least note down the timestamp on the video at this point. It should be around about the 6-minute mark so that you can refer to these more easily as you go through. Pause the video now while you get yourself prepared. Ready? Let's have a look at our first battle. The Battles of Ypres, 1914 to 1918. Yes, battles, not a battle. Ypres, or Ypres as the British troops called it, was attacked repeatedly from 1914 until the end of the war, but British, French and Belgian troops never surrendered there. Ypres was the last major Belgian city not controlled by the Germans. It was also the centre of an important road and rail network to places like Calais. Remember, that's an important port bringing in supplies. Both of these things made it an important target for the Germans. Ypres became a salient, a part of the line sticking into the German lines. The Germans occupied trenches on higher ground surrounding the city on 3 sides. This meant that they had a good view of the British soldiers and rained down terrible fire upon them. Key events then. The first Battle of Ypres was in 1914. This is where the British, French and Belgians stopped repeated attempts to take the city. Both sides then dug their trenches after the battle, the Germans partly surrounding Ypres. Then the second Battle of Ypres in 1915. This was the second huge German effort to take Ypres. It failed, but also marked the first use of poison gas in World War I. The French had actually used tear gas the year earlier, but poison gas is a different thing. Most famously, the third Battle of Ypres in 1917, better known as Passchendaele. This was a huge British and Allied effort to push the Germans back. It started well. The British had dug tunnels under German positions and laid enormous mines, literally destroying several hilltops where the Germans were based, such as had happened earlier at Messines in Hill 60. But then the weather and heavy mud of Ypres prevented real success, with tens of thousands of troops killed in the fighting in 1917 for very little gain of ground. Okay, for any military history experts out there, I'm aware that the Battle of Messines Ridge and the Battle of Passchendaele are different things. I've kind of lumped them together here so that we can handle it a little bit more manageably. Right, pause the video now and begin some of your notes. There will be, by the way, some more sources and more to go on, so don't think that you're going to be done just after this bit. Ready to continue? All right. So here are some extra details about the Battles of Ypres which may be relevant. Add to your headings where necessary. Source A. This is quite small because I'm going to try and fit quite a lot of information on the screen here, so make sure it's an HD and you might want to make it full screen. A British soldier describes conditions in 1917. It was mud everywhere. Mud in the trenches, mud in front of the trenches. Every shell hole was a sea of filthy, oozing mud. I suppose there is a limit to everything, but the mud at Passchendaele, to see men sinking into the slime, dying in the slime, I think that absolutely finished me off. Source B. A British soldier remembering the gas attacks of 1915. He was interviewed after the war. We started the march towards Ypres, but we couldn't get past on the road with refugees coming down the road. We went along the railway line to Ypres, and with people, soldiers and civilians, lying along the roadside in a terrible state. We heard them say it was gas. We didn't know what the hell gas was. When we got to Ypres, we found a lot of Canadians lying there dead from gas the day before. Poor devils. It was quite a horrible sight for us young men. Here's source C. The German attack at the first Battle of Ypres in 1914. You can see how the Germans are pressing on French, Belgian and British positions from all directions. This diagram demonstrates the digging of mines. It's not drawn to scale, and usually these will be done under strong points, which are often on hills, but you get the idea. Mining under a German trench. At Hill 60 and elsewhere, British and Allied soldiers dug tunnels under German positions, laying huge bombs that destroyed entire hilltops. It wasn't straightforward. They had to work in silence as the Germans dug tunnels of their own and used bombs to cause collapses, burying men alive. Sometimes men even fought hand to hand in the pitch darkness underground. Lastly, Source E. British horses stranded in the mud in 1917. As we can see, animals suffered in war too. Pause the video while you add to your notes. Let's have a look at our second battle, possibly the most famous and disastrous for the British in World War I. The Battle of the Somme, July to November 1916. In Britain, this is easily the most famous battle of World War I. The battle was supposed to be a huge breakthrough, winning the war. On the very first day, it became clear that it did not work. Despite a week-long artillery bombardment, on July 1st, 1916, the British Army lost 19,240 men killed, nearly 50,000 men wounded. The bombardment had not killed the Germans. All it had done is warned them of the attack to come. The battle is seen as a huge failure of planning, and the generals in charge have been criticised for not doing more to protect the soldiers. But the Germans suffered too. It has actually been argued since that they never recovered from their losses at this battle, whereas the British and Empire forces were able to recover. By November, the British had suffered around 420,000 men killed, wounded and captured. The Germans lost around 440,000 men. All this death and destruction put an extraordinary pressure on the medical services, who had expected to receive only 10,000 casualties a day, not 60,000 on the first day. Alright, pause the video here and start making notes under your headings for the Battle of the Somme. You can also add on to this that for all of this fighting and bloodshed, the British advanced at most 7 miles in the battle. Have a look at the map at the top right there. That rightmost dashed line that's labelled the 19th of November is the extent of the British advance by the end of the battle. You can see that in some places they hadn't advanced at all. The French did have a little bit more success in the central and southern regions, but it wasn't enough to break through. Our next battle, the Battle of Arras, April to May 1917. Check out the pictures first of all. These are pictures of underground dugouts that typify the fighting at Arras and makes it quite different from some of the other First World War battles. There was actually during this point as well a significant air combat part as well. Air combat was a very new phenomenon in the First World War. In April and May 1917, the Germans had a technical edge, as we should see, but the British were perhaps being more innovative, using their aircraft directly to support ground troops. The Battle of Arras was unusual in comparison to other World War I battles in some respects, but like others, it did not achieve the breakthrough that the British wanted, and it cost 150,000 killed, wounded and captured. One of the unique aspects of the battle was the terrain. The land was based on chalk. This was easy and safe to dig, and so large networks of tunnels were dug to provide cover for the men. There was an underground hospital too, with enough beds for 700 casualties. The tunnels were even fitted with electric lights and running water. The battle also made extensive use of aeroplanes to spy on the Germans and attack German troops. It was costly for the British. Better German planes, like the Albatros D3 shown in the painting, and pilots meant a British pilot had a life expectancy in missions of just 18 hours. It became known as Bloody April for the Royal Flying Corps. Okay, pause the video here and make the notes that you need to. Done? Let's move on to our final battle. The Battle of Cambrai, November to December 1917. You might get a bit of a clue as to what the key weapon is here. The Battle of Cambrai saw the British try and use new weapons and tactics to break through the German lines. They did break through, but not for long. The British decided not to risk warning the Germans of the attack by not having an artillery bombardment at the start of the attack, or at the very least they kept it very, very short. Instead, they sent in a secret weapon, 378 tanks. The Germans couldn't destroy the heavy armour of the tanks, and they fell back in panic. The tanks broke through, but couldn't hold on to the captured ground. Surprised by the success of the tanks, the British were too slow to send in infantry reinforcements, and the Germans captured much of the land back. The British had tried to use tanks at the end of the Battle of the Somme at a place called Flers-Courcelette. But by 1917, new Mark IV tanks were much more reliable and available in much greater number and had a bigger impact. Despite the failure to support the tank, the new tactics worked. In 1918, these new tactics, a short artillery bombardment, breakthrough with tanks, and rapid support from soldiers, and with air power as well, would be used to push the Germans back for 100 days in a row, which did end up winning the war. So perhaps part of the significance of the Battle of Cambrai is what the Allies learned from it, not the success of the battle itself. Pause the video now and add to your notes. Done? Well, here's a reminder of your task. You should by now have got those headings filled out for each of these different things. If you haven't done so, fill it in now. And then complete the check your knowledge questions. Pause the video while you make sure everything's complete, and then I'll give some pointers for the check your knowledge questions. So how did the Battle of the Somme put great pressure on medical resources? Well, the sheer number of casualties, particularly on the first day, overwhelmed them. So 19,240 men killed is over almost double what they expected to get in total casualties, including wounded. With 50,000 wounded men, and they were only expecting less than 10,000, it's no wonder the medical services were put under such pressure. It also went on for a very long time. It wasn't a breakthrough which was really quick. It lasted all the way up to November. So why was there so much fighting around Ypres? Well, the Germans wanted to take that last major city on Belgian territory. But also remind yourself of the map. Look at all those roads and railways leading into Ypres and how crucial that is for supplies. But also Ypres became symbolic. The way that it stuck into the German line made it harder for the Germans to defend their own positions. But also it was an irritation. Ypres should have fallen in the view of the Germans, and yet it kept on holding out. So what was so difficult about fighting conditions in Ypres in 1915? Well, not only was there an all-out German attack, but there was the first use of poison gas as well. Well, what about at Hill 60? Well, this is where they set those enormous explosive mines. And that made the fighting very difficult because while you were digging those mines, you were underground and having to deal with an enemy also underground. Which new weapons were used at Ypres in 1915? Poison gas. In particular, chlorine gas was used at this battle. And at Cambrai in 1917? Well, apart from new techniques, particularly the tank. But what was unusual about what happened at Arras? Well, other than the use of air power in a new way, the big one is that so much of it was underground. Not necessarily the fighting, but the support services such as that 700-bed hospital. Make any improvements that you need to, and then we'll move on. Finally then, which of the battles you have studied today did most to help Britain win the war? What else helped? Did the British learn from early mistakes? How did they use new tactics or ways of fighting? How did they use new technology? Overall, do you think the British Army fought the First World War well? What I mean by that is, did they actually end up fighting with competence? It's obvious that they won, but could they have won more easily? It's easy to have hindsight, isn't it? But give that some thought, answer them in full sentences, and pause the video while you do that. So which battles do you think did most to help Britain win World War I? Some historians would point to the Battle of Ypres. It was always an irritation to the Germans that they were unable to capture it, and they lost hundreds of thousands of men in trying to do so. Also, the Battle of the Somme, despite being a disaster for the British on the first day, eventually bled the German army dry. What about the Battle of Arras? It didn't break through, but it pioneered some new weapons and techniques, as did the Battle of Cambrai, where the British learned valuable lessons for 1918, which did end up winning the war eventually. So did the British learn from earlier mistakes? Yes, for the most part they did. We tend to focus on these seemingly hopeless human wave attacks over the top of the trenches towards machine gun fire. But we've got to recognise that by 1918, that middle image is far more representative. Aircraft supporting tanks, supporting soldiers with accurate artillery, a very modern way of fighting. How did new tactics help? Well, like I say, those combined operations of putting these different forces together really helped. If you're interested in learning more about that, in my Warfare Through Time playlist, I've got a whole lesson on combined operations in World War I. And how do they use new technology? Poison gas was a horrible part of World War I, but it did sometimes work. Most of all, though, aircraft, artillery, and tanks were the breakthrough weapons. So do you think the British Army fought the First World War well? It's easy to be critical of decisions like Ypres, Passchendaele, and particularly the Battle of the Somme. There's a popular perception that British generals were donkeys that were leading a bunch of fierce lions, that idea of lions led by donkeys. The stubbornness and stupidity of the generals compared to the bravery of the soldiers. Personally, I think this view is a little bit out of date now. The British Army was fighting a war the like of which the world had never seen. Mistakes were bound to be made in finding out how to fight. And ultimately, the lessons were learned, and the British and their allies ended up winning. The question as to whether it could have been done easier, well, that's open to debate, and you can have your own opinion about that. What I'm sure is not up to debate is how tragic it is that so many soldiers on all sides lost their lives.